Okay, so an entire society built itself around producing the finest soldiers the ancient world had ever seen. A military machine so feared that a single mention of Spartan resolve could reportedly change the course of a battle before a single spear was thrown. That is the story everyone knows. Here is the story almost nobody tells. Underneath that legendary military discipline sat one of the strangest and most economically unsustainable systems ever devised by an ancient state. A society that essentially outsourced its entire economy to an enslaved population it lived in permanent terror of, forbade its own citizens from practicing almost any trade or craft, and ultimately collapsed not on a battlefield, but through a demographic and financial crisis baked directly into its own foundational structure. Sparta did not fall to a foreign army storming its gates. It fell to arithmetic. Before we talk about the military, we need to talk about the economic foundation that made that military possible at all, because it is a system almost unlike anything else in the ancient world, and it explains everything that follows. Spartan society rested on a population called the Helots, an enslaved class, likely descended from peoples conquered in earlier Spartan expansion into the surrounding region, who vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens who ruled over them, by some ancient estimates at a ratio approaching 7 or even 10 to 1. The Helots performed essentially all agricultural labor in Spartan territory, working land technically owned by the state but allocated to individual Spartan citizen households, who received a fixed portion of the harvest as their personal income, while the Helots retained the remainder for their own subsistence. This arrangement freed every male Spartan citizen from the burden of working for a living entirely, allowing him instead to dedicate his life from childhood onward to military training, a genuinely radical economic proposition for the ancient world, where nearly every other society required its citizens to farm, trade, or craft goods to survive. Here is the detail that transforms this from an interesting historical curiosity into a genuine economic case study, because this system, however effective it was at producing elite soldiers, created a structural vulnerability that grew worse with every passing generation. A ruling class that vastly outnumbered by the population it depended on for its entire food supply exists in a state of permanent low-grade fear, and Spartan society organized an enormous share of its institutional energy specifically around suppressing potential Helot uprising. Ancient sources describe an annual ritual in which Spartan magistrates formally declared war on the Helot population, a legal mechanism allowing any Spartan citizen to kill a Helot without committing a religious or legal offense, and a secret police-style organization of young Spartan men tasked specifically with monitoring and, when deemed necessary, eliminating Helots suspected of organizing resistance. This is not a peripheral detail of Spartan society. It was a core, ongoing operational cost of the entire economic system, a permanent internal security apparatus required simply to keep the labor force that fed the entire citizen population from rising up against the small minority controlling it. Now let's talk about what Spartan citizens actually did with the freedom this system purchased them, because the answer reveals just how completely the state redirected its economy away from anything resembling normal commercial activity. Spartan boys were removed from their families around the age of 7 and placed into a state-run training system, commonly known by its ancient name, the agoge, where they lived communally, underwent extreme physical conditioning, and were deliberately kept on minimal food rations, which ancient sources describe as encouraging boys to steal food as part of their training, developing stealth and resourcefulness, with punishment reserved specifically for being caught, rather than for the theft itself. This entire educational and economic investment, spanning roughly a decade of a young man's life, existed purely to produce a soldier, representing a staggering allocation of a household's most valuable long-term asset, its sons, toward a single output with essentially no direct economic return beyond military capability itself. Spartan citizens who completed this training and reached adulthood were still not free to pursue commerce, craft, or trade in the way citizens of nearly every other Greek city-state could. Ancient sources describe strong social and, in some periods, formal prohibitions against Spartan citizens engaging in what were considered demeaning economic activities, essentially any work beyond military service, land management through helot labor, and civic or religious duties. This meant the entire class of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and traders operating within Spartan territory was drawn almost entirely from a separate population known as the perioikoi, free but non-citizen inhabitants of the surrounding region who handled the commercial, manufacturing, and trade activity that Spartan citizens themselves were culturally and often legally barred from performing. Sparta essentially split its economy into three permanently separate castes: citizens who fought, helots who farmed, and perioikoi who traded and manufactured, an extraordinarily rigid division of labor compared to the far more fluid economic structures found in rival city-states like Athens. This rigid structure produced a genuinely unusual monetary policy that further separated Sparta from the rest of the Greek economic world. Ancient tradition credits the legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus with banning gold and silver currency within Spartan territory entirely, replacing it with an intentionally cumbersome iron currency, heavy, low in actual metal value, and reportedly treated with a process that made it commercially useless for melting down and repurposing. Whether this specific detail reflects precise historical fact or later idealized tradition, the underlying economic effect described by ancient sources is coherent and consistent with everything else we know about Spartan society. A currency system deliberately designed to make foreign trade, luxury accumulation, and the kind of individual wealth concentration that could threaten the equality among citizens central to Spartan ideology, extremely impractical to pursue. A Spartan citizen attempting to accumulate meaningful foreign trade wealth using bulky iron currency worth a fraction of its weight in bronze or silver coinage faced enormous practical obstacles that citizens of trade-focused city-states like Corinth or Athens simply did not have to navigate. Now let's talk about where this entire system's fundamental vulnerability actually lived, because it explains precisely why a society this militarily dominant ultimately declined so dramatically. The Spartan citizen class, the actual soldiers this entire economy existed to produce, required substantial land holdings worked by helot labor simply to maintain the minimum wealth threshold necessary to participate in the common dining messes that were a mandatory component of full citizenship. And losing that minimum threshold, whether through inheritance disputes, land fragmentation across multiple sons, or simple bad fortune, meant losing full citizen status entirely. This created a demographic trap that steadily worsened across generations. The number of full Spartan citizens capable of serving in the elite military. The entire economy was built to produce declined significantly over the centuries following Sparta's peak military dominance. As land became concentrated in fewer hands and more citizen families fell below the wealth threshold required to maintain their status. This citizen population decline, documented across ancient sources, describing Sparta's military capacity shrinking dramatically between its height and its later classical period, represents one of the clearest examples in ancient history of an economic system's structural design directly undermining the very output it was built to maximize. An economy engineered with total single-minded focus on producing elite soldiers at the cost of nearly every other form of economic activity and flexibility, proved unable to sustain the population size that same military system actually required over the long run, because the land-based wealth threshold for citizenship simply could not expand fast enough to keep pace with population growth and land subdivision across generations, while land holdings, unlike a more flexible currency-based economy, could not easily be created or expanded without additional territorial conquest that became increasingly difficult to sustain as Sparta's relative military dominance in the wider Greek world gradually eroded. Let's build the two honest scenarios this system actually produced across Spartan history, because both are well documented and both illustrate the fundamental trade-off at the center of this entire economic model. The favorable outcome, the one Sparta achieved at its height, roughly the era surrounding the famous stand at Thermopylae and the broader Persian Wars period. A small citizen population, fully freed from economic labor and singularly focused on military training from childhood, produced soldiers whose battlefield reputation and actual combat effectiveness genuinely exceeded what a state of Sparta's modest citizen population would otherwise have been capable of fielding. This military reputation itself became a strategic economic asset, independent of actual troop numbers, deterring potential aggressors and allowing Sparta to project regional influence and extract favorable terms from neighboring states and alliance partners disproportionate to its actual population size. A genuine return on the enormous resource concentration the entire economic system was designed to achieve. The unfavorable outcome, the one that gradually unfolded across the following century and a half, following Sparta's costly and ultimately Pyrrhic dominance during and after the Peloponnesian War. The citizen population, the actual productive output the entire economic and social system existed to generate, continued its long-term structural decline. A well-documented trend, ancient sources attribute directly to the land-based wealth threshold for citizenship becoming increasingly difficult to maintain across generations of subdivided inheritances. By the time Sparta faced renewed military challenges from a resurgent regional power roughly a century after its peak dominance, its actual citizen soldier population had shrunk to a fraction of what it had commanded during its height, and the same rigid economic structure that had once produced Sparta's legendary military reputation now left it without the demographic base to sustain that reputation against determined opposition. Sparta's eventual and permanent decline from its position as the preeminent military power of the Greek world was not caused by a single catastrophic military defeat so much as by the slow, multi-generational arithmetic of an economic system that had never built in any mechanism for sustaining or expanding the very citizen population its entire purpose was designed around. There is one more layer worth understanding, because it offers a genuinely useful lesson that extends well beyond ancient Greek history into almost every organization we have examined across this channel. Sparta represents perhaps the purest historical example of a system optimized with total, uncompromising focus toward a single output, in this case, elite military production, at the direct expense of the kind of economic flexibility, currency liquidity, and demographic resilience that allows a system to adapt when circumstances change. This is precisely the same trade-off we have seen in miniature across modern examples throughout this channel. The sports franchise that mortgages its future for immediate championship contention. The ranch that optimizes so completely for cattle production, it has no fallback revenue when drought or market prices turn unfavorable. Sparta simply ran this experiment at the scale of an entire society across nearly 4 centuries, and the ancient historical record left us an unusually clear verdict on how that trade-off ultimately resolved. So did Sparta's economic system actually pay off across the full span of its history? The honest answer is that it produced one of the most spectacular returns on military investment the ancient world had ever witnessed, for a period lasting roughly 2 centuries, built entirely on the extraction of labor from a permanently subjugated population living under a state of institutionalized terror, and financed by an economic structure so rigid and so singularly focused on one output that it contained essentially no mechanism for correcting course once the underlying demographic math began working against it. The soldiers were real, the reputation was earned, and the decline, when it finally came, arrived not through the crushing defeat that ancient legend might lead you to expect, but through the quiet, compounding arithmetic of a citizen population that had simply, gradually run out of itself.